And he's an associate professor in agronomy at Iowa State and was also my master's advisor from 2019 to 2021.
Best years of my life.
Andy's passion for atmospheric science started during his childhood in Northeast Ohio, being fascinated by lake effect snow. Andy completed his undergrad at Ohio State, and from there he completed his master's and PhD at the University of Illinois in atmospheric science. Andy became a faculty member at Iowa State in 2014, where he teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses and conducts research on how land use impacts agro-ecosystem processes in tandem with global change. His team uses a combination of field studies, agro-ecosystem models, and remote sensing to quantify the impacts of agricultural land use change on water, carbon, and nitrogen cycles. The land use change that his lab is most interested in is a shift from traditional Midwestern grain crops to crops grown for renewable energy and bioproducts. Take it away, Andy.
Gotcha. Okay, so I was going through a bunch of my material preparing for promotion actually when I got invited to give this presentation. So there's never a better time to reflect and think about what you're doing and what you've done than when you're going through promotion. I think the process works pretty, am I in the right spot for the camera? Works pretty well for that. And at the same time, I sent off my paperwork, and those of you who got through that process, maybe it's like submitting your dissertation, you know it's a big workload, and then there's a bit of an empty spot in your life in the nights and weekends again. So I started reading a little bit about George Washington Carver. I thought it would be a good use of my time, a good transition away from that sort of process, and it actually spurred a lot of reflection. He wasn't a random person that I chose to have some biography here about George Washington Carver. He's a rich history at Iowa State University, and it turned out after reading about him just a little bit, I've thinking about how if he were here today, or thinking about the work, if I could show it to him and ask him about it, what are some of the ideas he would have, the questions and criticisms, honestly, he would have, and how does that influence my thinking about my own work, and maybe hopefully makes it a little more effective along the way. So I took what would be traditionally a regular research seminar and wrapped it in this idea that I've been thinking about lately, and what are the ideas and thoughts that George Washington Carver would have about some of the recent transitions going on in the bioeconomy. So I'll talk about George Washington Carver, or GWC for short, to bring people up to speed if you don't happen to think about him as much as I've been thinking about him recently. Some cool things that I've been exposed to related to the bioeconomy. That's a big umbrella. I'm talking about just a little sector and some companies and activities that I've been fortunate to talk to. It certainly does not cover the entire domain there. I'll of course show some data from my lab that relates to some of this and some activities around Iowa and collaborations. It's a talk that's super light on methods, super quick to show some ideas, and hopefully spurring a bit of a conversation along the way. And then I'm going to try to come back to the initial prompt here, reflecting on maybe some ideas that relate to George Washington Carver and his legacy. I am by no means a scholar of George Washington Carver. I've been reading up about him and learned, been inspired by him quite a bit. He has a heavy presence on Iowa State's campus. He attended there, Iowa State, from 1891 through 1896. He was the first African-American student at Iowa State. He was the first African-American graduate student and the first faculty member of African-American descent. So he did broke a lot of barriers at Iowa State, but also made a tremendous impact regardless of that trajectory of his background. He was born into slavery. His mother was a slave when he was born, then was actually abducted. And he came back from that abduction. They're not sure what happened with his mother. And he came back to where he was originally born, to the Carver family, and worked on the farm, and became quite an inspirational and productive human being despite some extraordinarily tough circumstances. And I keep that in mind because this biography that I've been reading about him has some complaints, some letters that he wrote to Booker T. Washington, who ran the Tuskegee School that he helped start the agricultural program for. So when someone experiences that and has complaints, you know that those complaints are put within a context that I think we should all think twice about relative to the things that we might want to complain about today. The man literally walked from Kansas to Iowa in pursuit of higher education. And I think it was in the summer. It would have had to have been like April 17th through 21st for it to be somewhat pleasant at all. The rest of the year would be terrible to do that walk. Maybe September 22nd through September 28th would have been the only other week. So George Washington Carver serendipitously was influenced by a lot of people, of course, but the Wallace family was one of the ones that's most well documented. Henry Wallace was the grandfather and father of 2 other Henry Wallaces you probably have heard about before, who were secretaries of agriculture and have roots at Iowa State University. Started Wallace as farmer and one of the most influential publications in agriculture at the time. Henry C. Wallace was a mentor for George Washington Carver while he was at Iowa State, and according to his own words, one of the most influential people in his life along the way. And Henry A. Wallace went on to start Pioneer Hybrid and the research, NRCS, so as the Secretary of Agriculture. So all these people, conservation, deep roots in agriculture in Iowa, were part of the influence on George Washington Carver. But also at the same time, this wasn't a group of people who wasn't pragmatic. So Henry Wallace, called Uncle Henry, the senior, had this quote that shortened here to say the marketing of crops is important as production. And I came into researching land use change and new crops with really thinking the end use was already figured out. That we were going to grow millions of acres of perennial grasses because we had to, because it was mandated. So I didn't think much about the end use. It was already there. As it's turned out, that hasn't been the case, and there's been lots of other advances in evolution and surprising outcomes in that space. And now we're basically at the ground floor, trying to figure out ways we could use a crop that was so well studied and characterized as potentially providing some benefits, but having limitations in terms of the market for using it. At the same time, conservation is super important. I think when you come from a place where resources are extremely limited, you're really conscious about conservation and waste. And when your food and your livelihood is so directly connected to the resources you have available, you're really careful with it. So there's a lot of quotes from George Washington Carver about preserving soil, not necessarily for aesthetics, but for sustenance, for being able to survive on the land and to be able to be well as a human being. At a time when, honestly, there's lots of quotes from some of the other influential agricultural minds at the time that said, if you mess up the soil, just go somewhere else. During westward expansion into the United States, there was lots of pristine soils that could be just a new start. And now we've basically found all those soils. We've changed all those places that were native vegetation, and we're at a place again where I think we should start thinking a little bit more about George Washington Carver. He published over 40 works. I have a quote about why he could have been more in a little bit. On topics from acorns to building soil to cowpeas. His work was really about reducing waste. Acorns at the time were considered a waste product, and he had a publication about using it as an animal feed substitute. I have not read each one of these bulletins in detail on my own, but they are covering an expansive range of topics that I think are a window into his world. He was in a really challenging place when he was getting started as an agronomist. He did work in Iowa, where resources were actually quite good in agronomic context. Everything that you put in the ground grew pretty well. And moved to the south, where there had been a lot of disruption to soils and weather in soils that were just more challenging in general in terms of starting a crop. And at the same time, he was in charge with starting an agricultural program, and for a new institute, a new program, and it was a really challenging startup time because part of his startup package, if you will, involved feeding the people who were there because there wasn't any other food. There was no cafeteria, there was no other housing. They had to build the houses, grow the food, maintain the pastures, and raise the animals at a time when there was really no one else available to do that. So he came across some frustrations when he asked for more resources. You have quotes about, you doubtlessly know that I came here solely for the benefit of my people and no other motive in view. When he was asking for more money, it wasn't because he wanted an increase in his salary, although he was offered a handsome salary to come away from Iowa State faculty to go to the Tuskegee. It was because he just needed the stuff to work. He probably would have had more publications than the 40 bulletins that are reported, but there were times when his publications, requests for print, were denied because the Institute did not have enough funding to produce the prints of the publications. Couldn't just go online open source at that time. They had to print them in hard copies, and the Institute turned them down on the publication of some of those. One this took 13 years to get printed, for example. And you'll see the utility in his work. So he was really inspired to do work that was approachable. He wrote it in a way that was readable by people who were not experts in his field or even super literate themselves, so they could sustain themselves and live a better life. He was there for the benefit of his people, and it's an inspiring mindset to have. So as you go through his publications and read his reading, he becomes more and more systematic in his thinking, from basically putting out fires to why do we keep ending up in the same place all the time. So you see more reflected in kind of existential ideas in his quotes. So As we learn more about ourselves and our relation to food, we realize that people aren't healthy if they aren't eating food and living lives that are kind of systematically good for them to have. So a lot of his works were related to just trying to make people's agricultural occupations, land use choices, and farming activities make for a better life for them and their families. He said, as a rule, we're wasteful. This is actually in the early 1900s. As a rule, we are wasteful. We don't know how to save. It's ignorance in the kitchen is one of the worst curses that ever afflicted humanity. At a time when food waste, I'm certain, was not as bad as it is now, right? So this kind of thinking really had me thinking more about the work that I do and introducing a non-food crop move into an agricultural system at a time when food might become increasingly limited is not lost on me along the way. So my take homes from the readings and the work that I've done so far studying George Washington Carver. First of all, he's a super nice guy. I didn't put that bulletin down, but there are glowing letters from people from aunts and uncles to family members to some of their children to school operators, just people, everyone he influenced, he was really nice to. So just keep that in mind, I guess. He was a systems thinker before that word even existed or before that was cool. He thought ecologically about ecosystems. Ecology was coined around the time that he was becoming a scientist. It wasn't even a field. He thought a lot about markets and uses and securing a livelihood for people with his work. And you can see the frustration in some of his writings. He was super interested in science and wanted to do kind of fundamental stuff and understand how the world worked. He actually was quite a good artist and wanted to work on that. And some of his letters, he reflected on how he wishes he could get people fed so he could go back to being an artist. But he realized that the well-being of people was paramount and a major challenge. And spoiler alert, this book's basically, which I think is a really nice biography, I recommend it. Do not have any financial benefits from recommending that book, but I think it's a good read. Spoiler alert, he didn't actually succeed all that well either. Right? There was major influence, there was lots of academic achievements, there was lots of great stories to tell, but at the same point, the prosperity and the outcomes that he was aiming for also weren't necessarily achieved in the way that he hoped for. He had high hopes, I think, but it wasn't necessarily a victory. So it just shows, despite all the positives and the happy stories you can tell about people, it can be quite a challenge. And I think where we are today is honestly a bit of a revisiting of that in some ways. So I'm going to talk about my program first in pictures. So we're going to pivot away from this idea of late 1800s, early 1900s agriculture and supporting ourselves out of the agricultural economy to kind of where we are today, because fuel and energy and the displacement of things that are derived from those things is basically one of our chief challenges at the time. So the way we do this in my program is we basically do a lot of scaling. So we do things like, come on, go ahead.
I'm sorry, there wasn't like an AirPod anywhere. Okay, thank you so much, I appreciate it.
It's a wonder that doesn't happen more often. No problem. It should make like a loud sound when you get further away. So we do scaling. So we do things like we plant experiments in the field, we measure the photosynthetic rates for individual leaves, we measure the canopy area of all those leaves combined. We use satellite images to try to figure out what that looks like for entire fields or plots, and micrometeorological techniques to monitor the movement of mass between the atmosphere and the plants in real time. And then we throw those things into aggregate system models so that we can do scenarios and thought experiments for places beyond what we have our immediate inference space from the measurements that we have. This is the same idea in words. I think I'll go ahead and skip past that. The issue is for any major transformation to occur, there's a big cart and horse issue that has been really well demonstrated by the renewable fuels scenario that I mentioned at the beginning. If you're going to do something and change a cropping system, an agro-ecosystem, there often has to be decisions that are supported at a large scale. Agreements of multinational companies, or at least multiple companies, production pathways that involve hundreds or thousands of individuals, and often there needs to be financial incentives along the way to secure or at least make sure that you're ensured that if you do not do absolutely perfect, that you'll still be able to sustain yourself as a business. There's a lot of coordination that's involved in that, and the impacts of all those decisions aggregate up to things like the Gulf and Hypoxic Zone, and all those ground-up, bottom-up issues don't necessarily lead in the direction of sustaining or maintaining nutrient inputs into the system. You can obviously change the constituents of the atmosphere over time with these kind of practices. And there's a lot of different factors on the landscape that affect the productivity, the outcomes, the cycling of the things that are important for our agroecosystems and their services. So to account for all those things, you need really detailed incorporation of processes, but you also need to be able to scale across a wide range of things. And to throw that in to new and novel cropping systems at the same time where data is pretty limited is a challenging space to be. The fundamental question we have is how does changing which cropping systems we're growing and their management affect the balance of carbon, water, and nitrogen? Through these three main fluxes in agroecosystems is basically underlies most of the services, the goods and benefits that we can derive, and also the economic incentive for doing them in the first place. So the work that I do and that I incorporate in my program is aimed at trying to close the balance of where the carbon in, where the carbon goes out, and how does the system change the carbon pools within that. Same idea with nitrogen. Every molecule of nitrogen that enters the system will go through some sort of transformation, but will eventually have to be retained inside of some sort of immobile structure, or will have to leave in the form of gas or in the water. So there's always a mass balance question at stake here. And we can see at a global scale, the mass of inputs into the major cropping systems, rice, wheat, and maize, around half of the nitrogen inputs, which is around half of the cost that we put into these systems, is lost through pathways other than into proteins and enzymes that we would consume to provide benefit to humanity. So this is our kind of status quo right now, where most of our cropping systems yield less than 50% return on the investment of nitrogen inputs, and I think there's lots of work that goes into altering the existing systems to have that fraction be higher, while maybe trying to increase the carbon that's in the soil. But what I'm going to talk about today is basically a more radical transformation of just changing the cropping systems themselves. Instead of trying to optimize the management of fertilizer or rotations and that sort of thing for some subset of the land, less than 10%, I would posit, we probably need to do something fundamentally different. We've seen that this imbalance over time has led to decreases in the storage of carbon in the soils of the greater Midwest. Somewhere around 50% of the carbon has been lost. When we measure those systems over long time scales, like this example is almost 20 years of carbon exchange from some maize systems, the scanthus and soybeans. Long-term carbon sinks, which is long-term carbon gains to the systems, are detectable in perennial systems. But most annual systems are near neutral or carbon loss over time. And it really fundamentally comes down to this idea. The soil, although this picture is probably the worst time of year to illustrate this, the soil in annual systems is bare for about 6 months out of the year, whereas perennial systems, that's closer to 3 or 4 months out of the year. And when it's not bare and it's not green, it's still being retained by root structures and plant biomass. Kelsey knows this figure, she made it. You never throw away a good slide deck. But in true me fashion, I've added more stuff to it. So these systems grow longer, but they also have deeper roots and potentially more massive rooting systems overall. They have potential to play a part in the circular bioeconomy, but we have to do some evaluation of those to make sense. Not only growing longer does it help you, taking more resources through photosynthesis retains carbon in the system, but it also can help reduce the nitrogen loss from the system, especially if you do some internal cycling of nutrients, which allow you to decrease the inputs in the first place, and the combined extended growing season. So traditionally in the Midwest, we have the production of nitrogen in the system by the soil biology, peaking early in the spring. Honestly, in about 2 or 3 weeks from now, there'll be a lot of production of nitrogen from the organic matter stored in the system. But we're not going to plant our main crops. Corn, soybean, you could throw on wheat in that example for another 3 or 4 weeks after that. Earliest would be in early April, and they're not going to grow substantially and take up significant amounts of nitrogen for another 5 or 6 weeks after that. It's just a long time. That 6-month period even gets longer when you consider the fact that they start from a very small place. So the idea is to grow high-yielding perennial grasses that are more synchronized with the production of soil nutrients over the growing season, reducing the requirements for inputs and reducing the chances for nitrogen losses over time. You can think about this in terms of nitrogen, and you can also think about it in terms of light. So we measure light capture by annual canopies and perennial canopies. The perennial canopy is the black dots, the maize is in the white dots. When we did some of the early work, colleagues at the University of Illinois, to figure out how these perennial grasses were growing so much biomass within the growing season with so little fertilizer input, they came to the conclusion it's not because of high flow synthetic rates at any given time. It's just that they're more workhorse. They spend more time capturing photosynthesis. The result pans out in the data. So long-term data sets now confirm that the nutrient losses from perennial systems is significantly lower than annual systems. And when you monitor the tile drainage over a long period of time, this is a data set spanning 12 years at Iowa State University by some colleagues there. They found about an 80% reduction in nitrate leaching from the perennial prairie system compared to the annual system. The cover crop provided a much smaller benefit of around 18 or so percent, but it was a reduction. And what else I want to say about this? The issue here at stake, though, is while they're providing a lot of ecosystem services, if you compare the productivity of the system, yield actually isn't even on this graph. Maybe it's excluded on purpose. The amount of economic gain from growing these systems doesn't quite offset the cost of the land rent you have to put into it in the first place. So the whole point of this agricultural activity in the first place is to provide a living for people. And if the main benefit is just making the water quality better, not providing a living for people, then you're already wrong at base one, and you can't even get further down the line in the argument. So long-term experiments have shown that water quality and carbon uptake is much better in perennial systems. Of course, we hypothesized this, but hadn't actually provided significant amounts of data for this and these kind of systems in the Midwest until recently, when some of the studies that were started around the renewable fuel standard had published long-term data sets. They found that the net ecosystem carbon balance, which is inputs minus the outputs, the retained soil carbon you would expect to be in the soil, is only negative in terms of carbon sink for perennial systems. Reducing tillage doesn't seem to be enough to retain carbon in the soil, and other management interventions just don't seem to be sufficient to cause significant amounts of carbon uptake. So it really seems like the main ecosystem services we're so interested in getting from our cropping systems, as of now, with the existing tools we have in our tool chest, are really only achievable by these perennial systems. The problem is we can't eat them, and I think if we're to pull back already to the argument that I started at the beginning of this talk, George Washington Carver would be asking some pretty critical questions about how this works with the farmers, their families, and the communities. If the primary activity of some of these people would be to grow a crop that doesn't necessarily sustain food. The developments that I'll talk about a little bit later on will kind of push back on that a little bit, because I think there's opportunities to intermingle these two cropping systems. We're not talking about completely displacing all food for energy. We're talking about putting them and integrating into the landscape, not only within space at a given time, but also thinking more systematically in terms of bringing animal agriculture and some other components into the system. There is some evidence for our existing opportunities on the landscape. If you think about things in flyover country terms, in terms of coarse pixels of data, the kind of remote sensing that an institute like this would have been looking at for the past 30 or 40 years, there really isn't a lot of room to do any change, because we're talking about highly productive landscapes across large spatial scales that mean that the opportunity cost is just too high to do anything else. But when you start looking a little bit closer, with newer information available, looking within fields, looking at pixels that are 1/100th the size of this room, you can have 10 or 20 at least inside this room, you start to be able to find some places where there's much more variability in what appear to be super homogeneous cropping systems and crop fields 30 years ago. We're understanding now there are places within these fields and the fields themselves that spend considerable amounts of time not producing enough output to offset their costs. So those would be stably low yields across a significant portion of the Midwest. So these crop losses are not negligible. There are places where, if you look closely enough and sum them up, we're talking about losing billions of dollars in economic output by growing systems that are not quite as well matched up with the soil resources and climate that are available to them. We can do things like play scenarios where we say, well, what if you don't fertilize and plant the crops the same way that everyone else does? What if we use a crop model that does a pretty good job of representing how yield is affected by planting density and by fertilizer rates, and try every single combination to figure out which one was optimal. So we try these things with cropping system models across the entire state of Iowa, for example. And what we find is in some soils, of course I've cherry-picked one here for this example, the return on investment is negative no matter what you do. So that means you're going to be spending more money than you're going to get out of the system. There are some soils where it will turn out green, and there are optimum combinations, and if you're good enough at agronomy, you'll get it right and you match it up well. But there are some systems, there are some places that show up in the red on these maps where year in and year out, combination by combination, you're unlikely to return a profit, and you're likely to be losing amounts of nutrients along the way, which then costs us additional money by having to remove the nitrate from the water system along the way. And when you zoom in even further, we find that within these fields, places often produce little to no biomass year in and year out, especially if they're susceptible to flooding. So when we tell our cropping system models that those places are actually bare, they're not growing any crop whatsoever, even though on average those soils can produce it, the topography causes total loss of crops. The prediction for nitrogen losses are even higher. So that means the benefit for trying something new would be even bigger, and the economic output from trying something new would be even better as well. So that the finer you get, the sharper you get, the brighter the picture sort of gets. But this is complicated. This is a lot of information. We've picked a few fields we've studied the heck out of, but we're talking about a landscape that covers millions of acres. The most recent land use changes have been largely in those places that are pretty susceptible to nutrient losses and low profitability. Although some people have managed to expand rural crop agriculture in areas and make a lot of money doing so, and I think, applaud them for achieving that. But these places were late to the game to adopt crops for a reason, because their soil resources and the landscape weren't necessarily conducive to profitable management. When we look a little bit closer at the driftless region, we see that there are recent land use changes. In his spare time, Josh likes to sing. He likes to wax poetic about land use change. There are places where watersheds that have some of the highest slopes are the places where the biggest changes are in terms of land use adoption are. And the majority of that land use is coming into row crop agriculture, whereas previously in grasslands or pasture, which would line up with that paradigm I showed earlier, ground cover change, reducing nitrogen losses and increasing carbon uptake along the way. When we look across the landscape, we think those are the places where we're disproportionately likely to lose our inputs, which means we're losing money along the way, not only having the environmental outputs, but also having the economic negative outputs. And this could be sort of a theoretical idea, this scaling up to the larger scale. But when we compare the losses of nitrogen from these systems in specific places that are poorly drained, that are unlikely to perform well in terms of corn and soybean yields, so top-down measurements done by people with tall towers like on the side, they match up better than when you just scale up an average condition where you don't include the hotspots and losses. So that's another line of evidence suggesting they're likely to be losing disproportionately. So the idea is, let's try something that could grow better. So serendipitously, we planted some plots. I'm looking at a colleague of mine at the University of Illinois who I collaborate heavily with. Planted some plots to grow miscanthus in central Iowa and some of the lower quality land that the university was generous enough to let us try out a novel crop on. And it turned out, it flooded regularly. And serendipitously, we took advantage of that and said, what if we purposely put more plots of miscanthus, this is the giant grass miscanthus, in places that flood on purpose and measure their outcomes. The idea is, if you are able to grow in places that flood more frequently, you'll take up those nutrients, just like I was talking about in time earlier, but now we can think about it in space. You'll take up those nutrients and have less losses and bigger returns for the farmer that's growing them in the first place. So the idea is, if you can strategically put perennial grasses in places that have cropland that have the most benefit for profit, water, and markets, it's the best opportunity to move forward. So we've conducted modeling analyses, looked across watersheds, looked across spaces, looked across different scenarios in terms of weather and climate, and said, yeah, it seems like there's actually a likely opportunity to actually potentially at least lose less money in specific places and lose less nitrogen almost for sure if we grow some novel crops. And there's even things now like water quality programs that will pay you for these practices, similar to other conservation practices that are being piloted across the country, and could become another thing to provide incentive for people to grow crops in the first place. And I don't think it's going to be enough to do it. Most people who grow plants for a living at scale would like to do it independent of incentives. If they're happy to take them when they exist, but they would like to have a system that on its own would stand alone and not be dependent on programs to do so. You can read 1,000 quotes that substantiate that along the way. So we need to think about some other opportunities for the uses of the crop besides thousands and thousands or millions of acres going into bioenergy. So I've been learning lately about a lot of uses of the material prior to or in parallel to going into liquid ethanol. So we can take this biomass crop that I showed earlier, chop it up into fine particles like you normally would when you harvest it, and it turns out it makes a really good poultry bedding. And so now it's used quite extensively on the East Coast for poultry bedding, For a while, we were going at Iowa State. We were selling our miscanthus material for a profit to a poultry farmer who hauled it over 100 miles away into his operation. We were able to deliver about 5 truckloads of poultry bedding, of material for poultry bedding to this farmer. He told us if you had 500, you would come back for more. We only had 5 loads worth of material. But then the bird flu happened. So anyway, that sort of changed things. But there's also opportunities to pelletize it and co-fire it with coal to make more electricity. You can make all kinds of paper products. There are new companies coming online now. In the southern U.S., they're looking to grow some substantial amounts of miscanthus for single-use plastic replacements. And you can either directly throw it into some animal manure to make renewable natural gas. I'll show you some other examples there. Sustainable aviation fuel is basically the new idea for ethanol for this, but to get from the $1 billion annual sales of liquid fuel from where we are now to there, you have to have other markets to basically help cross that bridge. So here's some pictures of miscanthus in action, poultry bedding. This bin is made of, over half of it is the mass is from miscanthus. I believe this company now based in southern Minnesota is using up to 80% of miscanthus to make these feed bins. They're biodegradable, so you put them out in the field. You put animal food supplements in them, they eat out of them, and they degrade after about 3 or 4 months sitting out in the field. The left one outside after a field day, it disappeared. The other one we keep inside, although it's starting to fall apart after a few years of demos. But it's pretty cool that this miscanthus that you're going to harvest it and turn into one of those feed bins over there. There are some deck chairs on the way to the cabbage shack, which is where our field site building is. That are made out of miscanthus that the company is sending to us as a demonstration. It's used for cattle bedding and erosion socks, and you name it. It's also used in anaerobic digestion, which you don't necessarily just need to use miscanthus for this. This is one of the cropping systems that's been getting a lot of traction lately. So I'll talk about not only miscanthus, but also managed prairies and a little bit about cover crops. There's an ecosystem of companies that are interested in these things, which is kind of cool. People who are looking to turn a profit in this. So it's gone from sort of this theoretical ecosystem-focused thing to a place where people are making substantial real money investments. You can learn all about them in the Biomass webinar series hosted by the Biomass Innovation Hub at the University of Illinois. They have weekly webinars. They're all archived on YouTube about a lot of these product chains that I talked about. There'll be more coming up for this coming semester. And there's now miscanthus being produced on roughly 20,000 acres in the United States across locations for various uses that I mentioned earlier. Mostly all east of the 100th meridian where irrigation is not required. In Iowa, we've been focusing on some of the commercial operations that better characterize their yield performance and understand their economic return a little better. Like I said, there's roughly 20,000 acres now of miscanthus in the United States. During this month, in March, I drove to Kentucky, I saw miscanthus. I drove to Ohio, I saw miscanthus. I drove to Wisconsin, and I saw miscanthus. And I know I did not put in my GPS the locations of these fields. They just happened to be there, although some of the fields were abandoned and no longer being grown commercially. But it is an expanding crop at a pace that's pretty interesting. The University of Iowa has over 1,000 acres of miscanthus associated with it, where within a field shed around 100 miles, there are farmers growing miscanthus for fuel for their boiler. They make it into pellets and co-fire it with coal. And yeah, so they're planning on getting over 1,000 acres. I'm not sure the exact total currently right now, and offsetting around 10% of the electricity load. This is dependent on a couple of developments that all need to come into place, but they have been growing it for quite a few years and pelletizing some of it, not necessarily all of it, for use in their coal-fired power plant. One of the most interesting opportunities, I think, that I promised earlier, I would talk about how food and perennial grasses can come back together, is with a company called Polterra. So their business model is they provide miscanthus bedding to poultry operations, turkey or chickens, for free, as long as the company will allow them to take the miscanthus litter back after it's been sold by the animals. That provides a feedstock for anaerobic digestion. You convert those carbon molecules into smaller carbon molecules, methane and carbon dioxide, that can be used for transportation or heating power outputs. And you break down these large molecules that plants can assemble naturally into ecosystems to be smaller ones that we can use again for energy along the way. It's essentially a waste product from poultry operations that can be used for energy. And then they take the byproducts of that, and they can produce some fertilizers from the anaerobic digestive, the leftover material from that process. So there's energy, and there's also some additional fertilizers that might be a little bit better in terms of retention of nutrients and less losses along with it. So you start thinking systematically, some of this stuff is starting to make a little bit of sense. Some technology adoption issues that need to be answered along the way, but for me, it's checking some of the boxes of my inspiration that I mentioned earlier. One last idea I'll talk about is, instead of just running all the dry matter, because it's an uphill slog to grow enough dry matter to be able to make enough money with cropping systems. The Center for Advanced Bioenergy and Bioproducts Innovation, CABI, is a Department of Energy research center that's basically trying to make the oil content that you might expect to see in a soybean crop and a tall grain C4 crop like corn all in one. So you take the oil from soybean and biomass from corn and grow them in one place. And you might actually have a really economically competitive feedstock that you can use to make all kinds of bio-derived industrial products from, well, everything on the screen here, flavor agents to detergents to back to the fossil fuels, back to the renewable jet fuel, and diapers and phone screens and eyeglasses. All the things that we get right now from fossil fuel derivatives, if you increase the oil content of your cropping systems, it could be derived from biological resources. So CABI is a bioenergy research center that's trying to increase the oil content of high-yielding C4 grasses along the way. It kind of covers the same area that I showed earlier where Wisconsin is being grown, and here are some pictures of the people involved. I'm going to show a bunch of data real quick, in about 5 minutes, from a lot of people who have supported my group over the years. So I'll do my best to attribute their contributions as I go through them. But I want to start off by saying this is a collaboration that's been really fun to do, and it's resulted in a lot of interesting information. Most of the data I collected is from the Sustainable Advanced Bioeconomy Research Farm in Ames, where we grow potential bioenergy grasses at scale. We plant them with commercial equipment, we harvest them with commercial equipment, and we sell what we can to commercial operators along the way. But we do so all while measuring the sort of inputs and outputs that I talked about earlier, trying to keep the mass balance of carbon, water, and nitrogen well under control and understood along the way. You have variance towers that measure the fluxes of carbon and heat and water in the system, but also a tile drainage network where the water that flows, that doesn't go through the atmosphere, flows through tile drainage to outlets where we monitor their quantity and quality prior to being disposed of downstream. This is what the equipment looks like out in the center of the field. A bunch of micrometeorological sensors. And this is what one of the soil looks like, where we drain off the water, siphon some of it, take it back to the lab and measure it for nitrate content. We also have information coming in from a network of sites across Iowa and Illinois. And as I mentioned before, it's the work of a lot of people spending a lot of time outside trying to understand how this grass grows. Outcomes. So there is evidence that the perennial grasses that I showed earlier, decreasing nitrate leaching will increase soil carbon content. This is the numbers I really want to talk with you about more later. This is the rate of change of soil carbon over the course of 7 years between 2015 and 2022 for a corn and soybean rotation, continuous corn with a cover crop, and a fertilized prairie and an unfertilized prairie. And what we see is substantial amounts of soil carbon change to the extent that we start to question whether or not they're physically possible along the way. These are soil cores taken from the field, very carefully analyzed. And our collaborators at the University of Illinois measured similar cropping systems at a totally independent field site and saw similar rates of soil organic carbon change that help us a little bit more confidence that these sort of rates of change are possible along the way. These are not in terrible disagreement with the eco-variance data that I showed earlier either. So it does seem like there's substantial evidence that perennial grasses can pick up carbon, whereas annual systems seem to have no significant changes. Our soil cores match up well with that. We also measured the nitrous oxide emissions, so that's another pathway for nitrogen loss. For these systems, we measured their efficiency of nitrogen losses, what's called the emission factor. In the perennial systems, even when you fertilize them, that's what I forgot to talk about earlier. The perennial fertilized system didn't lose much nitrogen either in terms of nitrate leaching. And it also doesn't lose a lot in terms of N2O as well. That longer growing season, again, not only helps with the organic cycling of nitrogen, but also the inorganic nitrogen we apply as fertilizer. Being around for a longer period of time helps us be tight in terms of the nutrients. We made computer models that take that sort of data and say, what if we grew prairies in specific fields? Before we believe a computer model, we have to compare it to lots of data. So this is work Mr. Oswald, graduate student of that. We looked at the biomass of several prairies at several locations, the nitrate leaching from one experimental site in Iowa. And so what if we put a prairie in a specific field that didn't do very well? There was some of the hidden opportunity that I talked about earlier in the class, earlier in the lecture. And what if we look across a wide range of conditions? Is this system going to be profitable and reduce nitrate leaching just 1 year and the latest year, or is it going to cover the cost for lots of years? According to our analysis, the most common outcome is going to be basically right around break even, with some years being unprofitable, other years being profitable. Which sort of sounds like row crop agriculture to me in a nutshell. What about the long term? We've conducted some of these experiments for more than 10 years. They produce low yields at first, a lot of biomass in the second and third year. They seem to stable off over longer periods of time. We've traced how that productivity is affected by differences in soil pools of carbon and nitrogen along the way. And of course, it's not surprising that the more organic matter you have in the soil, the less nutrients you need to apply, although it depends a little bit on the ratio of carbon and nitrogen. We can talk about more in detail later. We've looked at how the way we harvest it affects the losses of biomass. You can't cut it directly all the way up the ground. The equipment basically doesn't have enough horsepower as it is to cut it all the way down to the surface, so they cut it just above the surface, and we looked to see if there was disproportionate losses of yield closer down to the ground. We came up with a heuristic of around 50% of the biomass is lost at the current cutting heights of commercial operations. That leaves around some residue. You remember this figure, Dr. Chair? That residue actually helps keep the soil a lot warmer than it would otherwise be, and helps protect the crop from atmospheric conditions. So when we compare the temperature of the atmosphere to the temperature of the soil over time, the soil stays warmer and warmer when the air gets cooler and cooler, which means that you should probably think twice before just removing all that residue before the winter, because it helps keep this perennial system, which requires living through the winter to grow well, alive. I didn't catch all my boo-boos in my slides, Josh. I move things around when I talk to people using my slides. We found that if you plant higher rate of density, which this commercial operation allows us to do, these commercial planting systems can allow us to plant more rhizomes closer together than we used to do by hand. The initial carbon uptake is greater. So we looked at a lot of, sort of the traditional agronomic things you might think of with corn and soybeans, how close do we plant together, how long, well, how much fertilizer do we apply, how do we manage it. And we've monitored the carbon uptake and other ecosystem services associated with it. What we found is, when we planted at higher densities, compared to the rest of the research that's conducted at lower density planting, the initial carbon uptake is much more significant. Lower on this graph, it's better. And this is third year on this campus at a site where in the first year it was much more similar when we planted at high density. The downside of that is it establishes that you don't continue to see that rate. It basically saturates a little bit earlier along its life cycle, so it's not like you're continually getting more and more yield every single year. It just gets to its peak a little bit faster. We all know those kids in school who were 6 feet tall in third grade. That's kind of what I'm talking about. They didn't end up 8 feet tall. The nitrogen concentrations long term, we have corn and soybean in yellow and orange compared to miscanthus in green. Initially they were similar at the field site, but after several years they equilibrated quite a bit lower than the EPA green standard of 10 parts per million. In fact, most of them below half that requirement for most of the time. So the theory is panning out in terms of the ecosystem services in the field. We measure the carbon uptake, as I mentioned earlier, followed it through its various losses and pathways from harvest. We even found that the carbon, once it makes its way into the soil, has increased the water holding capacity of stands of these scanthus. So the soil aggregates in these chunks of soil that basically work well to hold soil nutrients and water. When we destroy those aggregates, that water holding capacity goes away. So leaving the system undisturbed has helped us to increase the water holding capacity under these perennial systems. And we took data in from these commercial farms that I mentioned earlier and determined that in most years they are above the break-even level when you look at their yield data and their expenses going. These are real farms, they're real size with real farmers. Early days of an adoption of a crop, and they're at least first go coming at above the break-even point. I'm going to skip past the specific study of the potholes because those are in the slides. to say we're at a point now where we're trying to merge all the things that I talked about earlier and come up with subfield models of these perennial grasses that can represent what we can measure with biomass sampling and satellites using a computational model that can also give us the carbon and water nitrogen cycling that we're so interested in. So perennial grasses play a significant role for the bioeconomy and helping with water quality goals, as well as producing some products we might be able to use. So other non-liquid energy related uses for these crops are already emerging in the region. I went through a lot of those examples. But we're going to need to figure out ways to prioritize the locations and the strategies for management that will optimize the uses and services and minimize the competition with these uses of land. We think we can do that by combining some of the tools I talked about earlier. So I think the examples I showed kind of encapsulate the systems thinking and ecology that I've been learning about. George Washington Carver, reusing this cascading use of material for anaerobic digestion and returning it as fertilizer, I think helps with waste. I think using land for what's most productive output is a way to reduce waste as well when you think about a land resource. We're seeing developments in markets for food that can help with the health of people and the ecosystems that we're looking to manage differently. And I think there's an argument to be made that there could be an increase in the well-being of the farmer and their family in these ecosystems. If you're growing crops that get processed and handled and upgraded more closely to where they're originally grown, that means rural communities might have more job opportunities along the way. But, I think, again, George Washington Carver will probably have some pretty hard questions about what we do in terms of feeding each other when we grow a non-food crop on the landscape. So with that, I'd like to thank you and take any questions you might have. Go, Kelsey.
Great talk.
Thank you.
I'm just curious if there's been any advancement in the planting methods for miscanthus, because the rhizome is more difficult, obviously, to get into the ground, especially, I'm assuming, if it was a small farmer wanted to incorporate that to certain portions of their field.
Right. So this planter is the state of the art that we have right now, but I know they're working on, Sputnik is the company that they've been working with grass company Agrotech this Kansas company to improve. So when it takes these rhizomes and bulk, because it's a pile of basically potato-like, finger-like structures, it sorts them out and tries to get them more evenly distributed. So there's probably opportunity to get more predictable numbers of rhizomes. They're all different sizes. They're not homogenized. People at Iowa State are still working on planting corn all the same way, all getting all the kernels facing the same direction when they go into the field. So it's no surprise. There's probably optimization opportunities to get the rhizomes the right size, the right location, the right orientation in the ground. They're pretty happy with this so far. The nice thing is, if you do put in a little bit, like it's not quite optimized, it'll kind of bunch together and grow similar to like the soybean would, whereas corn is basically going to grow straight up in that direction. But I think there's some opportunities. I think we're probably planting more than we need to. We can probably go back from 8,000, 5,000. The amount that you need to plant probably varies by the soil conditions like everything else. So I think it's an area that would probably help. Harvest cost is probably one of the biggest issues right now, though. The planting cost is one time. Harvest cost is recurring annually. They're trying to decrease the harvest costs.
Andy, are people still concerned about the overwintering problem?
Yeah.
Like, have people tried to expand further north?
So our furthest north site is in Newell, Iowa, and northwest Iowa. We were trying to locate, so Eric Sachs is a miscanthus breeder at the University of Illinois. He has a diverse germplasm all over the United States. I don't know that he has the same entry here that we planned at Iowa State, but he's got a network of sites studying the genotypic variability north of here in Wisconsin. I don't know of any commercial fields of miscanthus north of Des Moines that have grown. There's one that was recently planted this year that's just north of I-80. That's would probably be the furthest north that I know of. Out here where it gets really cold. There's some further north potentially on the East Coast, but the cold isn't there. So it's still a concern. The company that we sell our miscanthus to came and visited our site. They're from southern Minnesota. I'm blanking on the name or the location. The Worthington Container is the name of the company. They brought an agronomist with them, a farmer who was interested in growing miscanthus, and we told them, like, you would start small. start small because we never grown miscanthus, the distribution and the different types of miscanthus and how sensitive it is. We've never grown it that far north. So I wouldn't go for war and plant 500 acres wherever you want for the first year because we're not sure it'll survive. The issue is still there, but the genetic resources for integrating or combining some of the cold tolerance traits from the diverse germplasm has gotten much better. So, you know, you're getting to the point where you're going to know who are more or least sensitive, so that when you choose a variety, you would choose a more cold tolerant variety for the further north. I think we're within, you know, years of that sort of thing happening along the way, although I don't actually make that happen, so I probably shouldn't make any promises. But the work has gone on since our original work is still concerned.
This is the cost per acre on
Yes.
planting,
Yeah. This is much less labor intensive, much faster. It just drives right through the field like a corn planter does. Not 25 miles an hour like you sometimes see people planting corn, but it's come down substantially. We have the cost estimates in that paper in the cost per acre, but it's not as high as it used to be. Like I was telling Kelsey, right now the main issue is the harvest. So I should have brought the miscanthus stem with me, but it's pretty hard. And it actually dulls the blades of the chopper, so you have to stop, pull out of the field to avoid fire concerns. And there's an automated sharpening process where it's basically like a chef's knife, sharpening the blades back up and go back in. What we found from talking to the commercial producers is the people who skip over that step actually end up spending more time harvesting because they have to go so much slower than if they would have got out of the field and sharpened the knife in the first place. It's like backing into the parking spot, you know, it's actually worth it in some situations. Just go along the way. That's what they're mainly concerned with. Agritech and the company I was talking about earlier, we have a monthly phone call with them. We talk about operational stuff just to sort of keep our thumb on the pulse of what's going on in this space. And they had some horsepower tractor they were trying to harvest in Maryland with. They were super stoked because they thought they could drive way faster. And because the hours is what cost them in the field. So I think that's the next frontier for bringing down the costs along the way. There aren't harvesters that are specifically made for miscanthus, for example. There aren't very many options anyway, specifically designed for it. Go ahead, Josh.
How do you expect miscanthus to do under like future climate scenarios, like warmer and wetter, like in the modeling work that your lab has done? What are some of the key findings?
Yeah, so one of the key areas is the reproductive growth. So miscanthus does flower, but it's actually not essential to its growth, its life cycle. It'll put out a flower, there's no viable seeds in it. So that stage is the most sensitive stage to high temperatures or high vapor pressure requirements of the atmosphere. And since it doesn't go through that, I think it's going to have a lot of opportunity to grow well in those stressful conditions. The downside of that is it's a perennial crop. If it does sustain some drought damage or some flood damage, you will see the impacts for multiple years then. So the pendulum will swing a little bit harder, although it may not swing as often. It'll swing hard when it does with the perennial crop. What we found is in those potholes, which I had to skim over for time, is the areas where the plant grew after the first year, they kept growing back whether or not it got flooded. I have pictures of the grass this tall, the water this tall, the water drains, the grass lives, it does just fine. The areas that don't do well are when it floods as a baby, before it's able to establish a rhizome and root mass. That has drowned out some of the miscanthus, but other than that, it seems to be able to grow pretty well in those conditions. So I think outside of those areas where it's literally knee deep, it should do pretty well. For corn and soybeans, if they have standing water, even this much, for a short period of time, they tend to die. Whereas in miscanthus, it requires significantly more water to drown out. So I think, on the whole, I think it's going to be better adapted to higher temperatures and higher precipitation events. I would love to try that out experimentally, though, for sure.
We have time for one more question if it's out there.
I have something, but it might be a little out of left field.
Challenge accepted.
So, I know a concern is miscanthus or biofuel replacing food crops like corn. However, a lot of the corn we are growing for biofuel.
Right.
So I'm wondering, in terms of like the amount of energy you can get off an acre of miscanthus, how does that compare to the amount of energy you can get off an acre of corn for ethanol?
So if you get the high yields that we are seeing in some of the better commercial fields, it's more. And I think part of the problem is we don't have a full factorial experiment where we have corn and miscanthus growing side by side in the same field over long term. to be able to figure out if that's going to always be the case, or some cases it won't one out or another. So if you have kind of average yields from the fields that we typically monitor, you'll have more ethanol per acre. But if you take all the corn grain and all the corn stover too, because corn produces a lot of stover that we were talking about earlier, then that will actually be more ethanol than the miscanthus alone. But of course, then you have to put more fertilizer on it, and you have to have more. There's more likelihood for soil erosion along the way. I think, yeah, if you're talking about like a heavyweight bout, I don't know that miscanthus would necessarily always win that. But in terms of thinking about the rest of the system, it's more of a midweight kind of thing in terms of being pretty good at a lot of things, not necessarily being the best at growing the absolute fastest. But like I was talking about with Chris, there's different varieties of miscanthus. It's not been improved whatsoever. This is a sterile clone that we're growing. It's not been selected from the Midwest. It's not been bred. It's not been, even traditional breeding hasn't been applied to it. So there's got to be opportunities to increase the productivity of the crop with some breeding and genomic exercises along the way that would probably help it. Whereas corn yields are still going up as well. But it seems like most indications are that it's approaching a bit of a ceiling where this crop has been unimproved and it's already on parity. So,
Corn has a bit of a head start in terms of breeding.
yeah. Yes, and thanks to Henry Wallace.
So it's possible if we replace a lot of ethanol acres with miscanthus, if the miscanthus outperforms the corn with some breeding and time, it might actually free up more acres for real food production.
That's a possibility as well. Yeah.
All right, let's thank Andy again.